Welcome to the Fractal Leader. I'm Ashraf Ansari, and this is where we explore patterns within patterns, how ancient wisdom, modern technology, and human potential intersect. Today, I'm very pleased to be speaking with Morten Elvang about his work on liquid organizations. Most people think AI is just going to automate what we already do, but Morten sees a deeper pattern that AI fundamentally changes how organizations need to be designed. So let's dive in. Morten, thanks for joining today.
Thank you for having me.
So let's get right into it. You're in your work, the liquid organization. One of the things I notice is you describe sort of this catch-22 where organizations need to transform to fully leverage AI, but they also need AI to enable certain types of transformation. And I think this is really interesting because it explains why some AI initiatives create more value than others. Can you talk to me through what you're saying? Like when you talk to senior leaders who are investing in AI, but they're trying to accelerate the results, what's kind of the key unlock that they need to have?
Yeah, so let's try to take the quick in-flight first. The point I'm making is that generative AI as a technology is catalytic. It can help you with anything. You already alluded to the point from the MIT report recently that came out that told that 95% of all corporate AI initiatives seems to fail. But other numbers suggest that the employees are just using generative AI anyway for their own reasons. And that's it, literally to the point is that there's literally nothing that it can't help you with. But the thing is then that it means that it's not a technology you can lean on. It's not transformative. So it's not like an ERP system or a new core banking system that you will introduce and organize around. This one you need to figure out first, how do you want to organize? And then you need that new operating model to pull through the benefits of generative AI for the organizational level. It doesn't impact task level automation. It doesn't impact what you can do with AI in the product, but it really impacts what you can do with AI for orchestration and coordination.
That's interesting. That's interesting. And let's expand on that, right? You mentioned catalytic. AI is catalytic and not transformative on its own. So in a way, you're saying that AI amplifies what's already there, which is why the organizational design becomes even more important, right? If you've got an organizational design that's not effective, AI is just going to amplify that, right? I like this a lot because, what I think about is this framing keeps humans at the center, at the core of it, right? Because that human structure still needs to be right. Where do you think human judgment becomes most critical in a liquid organization? What are the decisions that AI can assist with versus the ones that require human wisdom?
But you see, it's a bit of another thing because, of course, there's a lot of speculation at the moment about technology being even more intelligent than us. But when you look at the organizational level, there's a different opportunity that doesn't have the typical ethical and moral implications, other than you can say access to information and privacy at work. Because literally what you do is that you use the capacity of generative AI to access what you can call dark data, unstructured data, and you use its capacity for doing combination at scale. And I like to use an example which is inspired by other examples. So some people talk about the container that transformed world trade. But the container itself didn't make the money. It was the way it influenced the value distribution by making transportation easier and more affordable. Then there is the lift that changed the configuration of cities, not by what it was, but what it enabled in terms of how you could build future cities. And there was something similar in technology about 25 years ago, about the turn of the millennium, something that's called continuous integration, continuous delivery, or the code delivery pipeline, that really collapsed the time it took to compile and integrate and deploy your code from infinite to zero. I mean, I worked in an organization where it took more than a year from code was ready until it was finally deployed in production. And within a few years, that shrunk so that you could deploy as many times as you wanted within a day. There was literally no latency in that process. So that is what it is, but that capability actually enabled technical agility. So that basically created the conditions under which you could use work in fast iterations. And you could say, well, it's just a technical thing. But if you use technologies like test-driven development and had like your commercial customer interests represented as test cases, you literally had a way of putting your client into the compiler, even if it was just a consistency check of what was compiling and what was running after compilation. And that capability we have today at the planning level. So I think what we will see is that we will see planning cycles collapse. We will see coordination cost go towards zero. And all the technology you need to do that is already in place. So it doesn't add anything to what is, but it collects and takes the consistency. And in that, it can help you understand where you have omissions and overlaps in the set of activities that you are funding at work.
That's really interesting. There's two threads I want to pursue there. One involves structure, and I think the other one's about speed. So let's start with structure. Are there contexts where traditional structures serve the mission better? Like situations that require absolute clarity of authority, emergency response, highly regulated environments, safety critical operations. What are the conditions you'd say maintain clear structure in those scenarios? Or does liquidity work even in those contexts?
Well, I would say it does, because so we're a little bit jumping ahead, and I think the question might naturally come later. But you can say, in terms of who can decide what is something that should be well understood, so there should be a transparency around that structure. So as an individual operating in a system, you would know what is your authority to make decisions. And I like to put things the other way around, is that for me, strategy is a central concept in understanding how liquidity works. But the key thing about a strategy is that it's got to be actionable, which means that it has to be relevant for the context and the time frame within you operate, so that whatever the strategy informs you to do, you can actually do something about it. So in that sense, I see a very high degree of delegated authority within the scope of the portfolio of things that you are administering. But part of that thing, which I call an accountable contribution, is also to know what's the limits of your authority. And one of the most fundamental principles is the idea of bringing no surprises. So in that sense, that if you have a stakeholder who is really supposed to drive a certain decision, then you are not supposed to just charge ahead and do what you think is right and talk about it later. You're supposed to proactively seek the guidance of that choice that's facing you in the situation.
Yeah, that kind of relates to where I wanted to go with speed, given what you just described, right? Needing to ensure alignment, I guess you could say, right, with stakeholders. Modern organizations, they need to move quickly, rapidly adapt, respond to market changes. The human elements that drive great culture, empathy, deep connection, psychological safety, those take time to build. So how do you think about this? Can an organization be both highly adaptive and deeply human at the same time? Are there practices that help balance that speed with depth?
Some years ago, I came across a study from a Danish psychologist who studied stress at work. And she had a very surprising finding, which was that where you normally would suppose that stress would correlate negatively with the ability to guide your own work, you could call it freedom. She actually found out that the curve had a U shape. So if you had false degrees of freedom, that could be immensely stressful. And the situations he brought up would be someone who, in the context, was really constrained on the means they had to do their job, but had the full freedom to administer that impossibility because they a little bit felt accountable for something that they couldn't influence. And in that sense, when you find a way to work with work, I call it like a useful collaborative structure, where your degrees of freedom follows your means to act usefully, then I would say that's generally conditioned to be a much healthier work environment than other similar environments. So basically, your responsibility follows your means to act in a balanced way. And then, of course, you have the whole set of other issues. And it's very hard to disagree with the idea of psychological safety and something that you really need to actively invest in. So in that sense, probably more than other organizations, the liquid organizations with high degrees of self-coordination and self-management that's needed to make it possible also depends on people feeling safe to engage in working with their contributions.
Yeah. I like how you tied that empathy building and safety to the degrees of freedom. That makes a lot of sense. There's an important aspect that you just called out around people feeling like they have psychological safety, right? Let me bring in our middle manager into this equation. It's a layer that's evolving a lot given the current landscape. Leaders oftentimes have built their careers on coordination, information flow, and they're being asked to lead very differently. In light of the ideas that you're talking about with liquid organization, AI transformation, what's the value proposition for these types of leaders going forward? How do they show up differently? What does excellent or good look like for a manager in an increasingly liquid organization?
Yeah. Well, so first of all, I don't think that there's necessarily any good news coming for the sort of intermediate coordinating roles, because that's exactly what the structure is challenging. So you can say what liquidity does is that it makes the controls intrinsic rather than bolted on. So you will not have things like status reporting. You will not have things like product management offices. You will actually have much fewer centers of excellence, etc., which are the sort of amplifiers or catalysts of the classical structured organization. But if you give it a think, you will also see that many of those are really there to compensate for certain dysfunctions. And a lot of this rests on the classical perception that there is a certain span of control in how many people one person can lead that's been traveling with us ever since the start of the Industrial Revolution. And it's really that span of control constraint that's now being broken by generative AI's ability to underpin the coordination, meaning that more people can work more freely together without the coordination burden not being able to be lifted, because it's not no longer a human mediation. You can do that mediation in other ways. So I personally predict that sorry, just have to get some windows over here. Sorry about that.
Sure, no problem.
I personally predict that there's going to be a huge change in the workplace, a shift from like the more bureaucratic leader to the significantly more meritocratic leader. So that means someone who is a primary contributor, him and herself, will typically be the one to lead the work of other people. And I also foresee a significant reduction on what you can call the bureaucratic overhead. The prototypical examples are the sort of untransformed public organization or the untransformed financial organization. And honestly anything else that looks a bit like this. Pharma is a big candidate as well. So big organizations with a lot of people with heavy decision structures are very likely to experience a significant reduction in the decision cost that they're facing.
Okay. I understand the logic, right? If AI handles coordination, what were middle managers, doing? This concept, I think, is going to make a lot of people uncomfortable. Um, what's the new role for leaders in the middle of organizations if coordination is not their primary value? Is there something they do instead, or it sounds like you might be saying that we literally need fewer of them?
Yes, or we need fewer hands to do that type of work, but that doesn't preclude that those people can do other things. So I think I don't really have a strong stand on that. I just point out something that I feel is inevitable. And part of my logic is also that I'm actually subscribing to the observation that this is the biggest change since the Industrial Revolution in terms of how we're organizing work. It's going to be crazy disruptive, but it also means that it's not a choice. I mean, my prediction is that we will see industries which have not really been digitally disrupted so far, finance, public governance, big companies that look like them, who has not really digitized their internal coordination. Unless they are in a really great situation, they will simply be forced to go this way simply to be able to compete because they cannot carry the cost load that they have been used to.
So that's a provocative idea, provocative statement. For leaders that are listening in, who are in that layer right now, any thoughts on how they should be thinking about evolving their role? What capabilities become more valuable once coordination is automated?
Well, exactly. So of course it's going to be a change as well, and it's going to be learning a new behavior. And I stick to the guardrails I laid out, meaning that you got to figure out how to work differently before generative AI can really help you. But that said, you got everything you need for it. So why not lean into it and be the one who leads your organization in going this way? It's the similar advice you had 25 years ago when we realized that we could actually automate the code administration in large organizations. And the advice was simply, throw everything you got after automating your code pipeline, because it's going to give you disproportionate benefits once you get that. You could say you get that source of errors factored out by keeping it digital, and it proved to work really well. I mean, it literally reduced the cost of quality. It reduced the cost of coordination related to integration and deploying code significantly and enabled the whole era of agile working. And while we don't still know exactly what will it mean at work, we know that the technology is there and it will lead us to find new ways of working together that's different to what we know today. Will that be for everyone? Well, yes and no. So if you're like a customer-facing team, if you're serving the client, actually my guess is that your work already today is significantly more digitized than it ever was before. If you're in a big industry, but if you're in the center of the office, if you're doing coordination of work, if you're driving technology development, a lot of the coordination is still done with classical governance, meetings, reporting, alignment, etc. And that's what's likely to change.
That's interesting. One of the concepts that you talk about in your work is this idea of conversational debt, right? And as we're talking about this idea of automated
Yeah,
coordination and
yeah,
middle management role changing,
yeah.
that's kind of where my head goes. And just to define it a little bit, I think you talk about conversational debt as the sort of hidden cost of what goes unsaid, right, in organizations. Um, which is really cool, right? That this is the organizational friction that slows decision making. Um, let's talk a little bit about this in light of what we just discussed. how do you measure conversational depth? How do leaders even know that they have conversational depth, right? And once they have it, what is the path to reducing it?
Yeah. Well, maybe it requires a little bit of contexting. And I will also say openly, it's a concept that I'm playing with, but I think it explains a few things. So the classical large organization, as someone cleverly put it, was not suffering from starvation. It was suffering from indigestion. There was simply, and today there simply is often too much work in the pipeline for you to process. So you're suffering from a certain overload that partly comes from a lack of coordination, meaning that more people independently schedule work that depends on the contributions of others. And because of the jigsaw puzzle that needs to be laid for everything to process through, these dependencies end up causing delay because they doesn't get served, either because they have been overlooked or because they are blocked by other work. So long story short, things have a tendency to pile up. We have talked about that as the predictability problem, meaning that it's very hard to predict how long it takes to do a certain piece of work. And very often you will not even manage to do it in a way where it satisfies the initial expectations. If what's said about agentic AI and its ability to go in and actually process work in collaborations with humans, then quite soon the problem will not be to get things done. The problem will be, what do we want to get done? And I think there is a related issue which is interesting, is that we have tended to think of opportunity as unbounded, meaning that opportunity is literally endless. But I think what we will be facing is that our customers' ability to consume new things is not infinite. I mean, there can simply be too much new too often. So sooner or later, you gotta find a way to hold your horses, that you cannot just keep feeding new innovative stuff to the market. You will be freaking everybody out. You gotta find a way to pace it. You gotta find a way to agree what's the next right thing to do. And that's not something that's in the script. That's actually something which is in the human ingenuity. We have this ability to do abductive reasoning, is that we can make hunches on what's the right thing in the situation, something that you can then later validate once you got the idea or got the epiphany. But that's something the agentic system can simply not do for us. So when I say conversational depth, I really mean all of that. I mean that you got to make sure that in hitting the market, you do that in the way you intend to do, in a way that best serves your customer without overwhelming them by giving them everything they ever asked for. Because if we have learned one thing, then it is that a customer rarely want what he or she asks for. They always want something a little different, and maybe not that often. So back to what you were asking, is that from having like control checks, are we where we think we are? I think we need to have conversations about, are we doing what we really should be doing? So it's shifting the balance from coordination of action to coordination of aspiration, making sure that we want to do the same thing and ask the same thing from our teams who are working with the agents much faster than we can supply work.
That's really very interesting. And I like it because I think one of the things I've been exploring related to what I asked you earlier around the unique human capabilities or contributions in light of AI and agentic tools is this idea of human judgment, right? So I think it aligns very well with what you're talking about in terms of, if opportunity is unbound and we essentially have almost infinite capacity, then it really is judgment in deciding what should be the next thing that we deliver to the marketplace. Because as you said, the customer's ability to absorb that is becomes the new gate, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
I
th-
yeah,
yeah.
I have a wonderful example that is already a reality. I worked in a customer-facing situation while there were still like physical offices where the clients could come and meet people, customer touch points. And it was like a huge organization with a lot of diverse products. And at any given time, each of those customer touch points had at least 40 different things cooking. And they came from 40 different places in the organization. And from each of those organizations, it was the one and only thing that they just had to get to the customer fronting people so that it could start doing its good. But the people in the local offices, they were just overwhelmed by change because they were just having change doors and windows all the time from all this energy to innovate in the larger organization. So there was simply a need to make a modulation of the pacing of change towards the local offices, that it didn't become too overwhelming. And you also stepped into the customer's shoes and said, yeah, sure, but is this really something that's going to make a difference, either in how we serve the customer or in how the customer wants to pick up our products? So I think we have already examples of this phenomena, but when everybody can do whatever, whenever, and tapping into this unbounded opportunity, there is a risk that every single change gets more and more granular, and with that, probably either something that's not really noticed by the customer and they expect it as a free upgrade, or something that's overwhelming and confusing because you just had a new product last week.
Yeah. It's almost like the strategic skill shifts from how do we execute faster to how do we choose better,
And what not
right?
to
Like the
do, which
judgment
is
becomes more
always,
critical. Yeah.
yeah, what not to do is becoming even more important.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. So, this kind of relates to this idea of strategy, right? Like strategy given in light of all of this. If the question that a lot of people are asking right now might be, how can AI help us move faster, right? But if I'm hearing you correctly, it's kind of the wrong question, right? The question should be, how do we build the organizational wisdom to move at the speed that our customers can actually absorb, right? To really expand on that judgment piece. So you're talking about a world where AI is handling coordination, right? The digital removes execution constraints, so our capacity starts to really take off. But customer readiness is still at that human speed. So it's like that bottleneck has now shifted all the way down to the customer. So what does that mean for organizational strategy? Right? If the old game was build faster than our competitors, what's the new game? Is it understand our customers better than our competitors? Is it choose better competitors? What are your thoughts? What does organizational strategy look like, assuming this
Mhm.
age of infinite capacity to do stuff?
Yeah. Well, it's a story in its own right, but let's just spend a minute to think about strategy. So the thing about strategy is that while everybody agrees it's important, it's also one of the most confused concepts in business. And you still have a situation where if you meet a senior team, they can rarely account for their strategy, even within the senior team who is sponsoring it, on what it actually is and why they have it. But if you look at what it is, really, it's the place where you combine thought and action, or as I like to call it, aspiration and action. And it's something that you can observe in every human collaboration. I mean, if you watch a team of people doing something together, then after a while you can form a view on what are they trying to achieve and how are they trying to achieve it by just observing them. And I believe in that sense that you can actually argue that strategy is present in all form of collaboration. So imagine now, instead of having strategy coming from the North Star and being fleshed into initiative that gets pushed to everybody's desk as extra work that they rarely have time to do because they have much more important things to do. Now imagine what would happen if you instead ask every team, what strategy are you seeing yourself following? How do you contribute to what we are trying to achieve in this organization? And then integrated that up to the level of corporate strategy or business function strategy or whatever perspective you wanted to give it, and say, oh, wow, it looks like this is what we are doing at the moment. Is this really what we want to do? So it doesn't actually change anything to the underlying logic, but it changes a lot to how you bring it into the organization and what kind of conversation you have, from a little bit like, how come that you lazy people have not been doing my strategy, to, oh, wow, this sounds really wonderful. I can see that you are really sort of throwing in your best self in doing what we are trying to achieve. And I think we should rather do something a little bit different for having everything add up. I think that, I mean, just without changing anything else, that would be a much healthier conversation in most organizations, where it would be much easier for the team at any level to relate to what is their role and contribution in terms of making the whole thing work. Now then, add some of the things that we are talking. So there's actually arguments that strategy is changing the role from being something directional to being something navigational. When something surprising happens in your context, you actually relate it back to your understanding of what are we trying to achieve and how are we trying to achieve it, and asking yourself, okay, oh wow, so how does it impact what we have going at the moment? Do we need to change something, or do we need to dig in harder from what we understand? So it brings a number of great things with it. It gives local autonomy to act within what's being promised with the strategy. Or if you have a local situation where you're forced to act, it gives a way for reintegrating with people around you by reconciling how do these part contributions add up to whatever makes sense for the greater whole. So in that sense, when more freedom is given and where people can more freely form to whatever work is important, I see strategy to become the instrument for reading the landscape and integrating accountably with people around you. So it simply becomes like a language for integration in the organization.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, it sounds like you're talking about strategy as almost a fractal, right? So instead of everybody's marching to the same tune, it's that word that you just used, that integration, right? How do the local strategies connect and inform each other? And so in light of that, if you're looking at this from like a senior leader's perspective, the shift is perhaps moving from telling everybody this is what we need to do to help everybody see how the strategies integrate. That's kind of the shift.
Yeah. And it's also a consequence of the planning cycle shrinking. And it's been documented also scientifically that complexity is rising. So more and more often you get disturbed by things you simply couldn't predict coming, and they also tend to be quite big events. So these 100 years event like COVID, etc., tend to happen more often, more impactful, hitting here and there. So it also forces a break of the typical budgeting and planning cycle, which would go like yearly, 3-year, 5-year in some industries, so that you can no longer strategize on cadence, including the budgets, but you actually need to do that on demand. When something significant enough happens, you need to give everything a rethink and then redistribute your resources to whatever is the new meaning. But also, as the pace increases on how often you have to change, you can no longer do that extrinsically. You simply need to find a way to somehow build that in to your organization, that it can absorb and respond autonomously, and then do the reintegration after the fact, instead of trying to have planning replanning to be the response before you can do any action. You simply don't have the time for it, and the coordination overhead is just growing if you try to do it with the classical means.
Okay, so this is sort of this implied strategy idea that you talk about in your work, right? The best choice in the moment, given what you know currently.
Yeah, so again, maybe implied, if it's okay, I could just quickly explain.
Yeah,
So,
please.
so
Yeah.
implied strategy is a bit of an artificial construct. For people who know anything about law, they will know that in Roman law, they have this bonus pater. So if the law is a bit fuzzy and you're discussing what would be the right thing to have done in the moment, probably against what someone did, you can argue that the good person, the bonus pater, would in this situation most likely have done like this. He wouldn't have run away from the accident. She wouldn't have drunk so much that she couldn't fulfill her obligations next day. A good person wouldn't do like that. So even if the law says you can't run away from an accident or you can't drink your head out in the bar if you have important duties tomorrow, then you can build the logic that it's just not the right thing to do. So in a similar way, you can look at the situation and say, okay, for everything we know with the information we have now present and the situation we are in, what would be the right thing for us to do in the moment? And the interesting thing is that it doesn't force you to actually do it, but it gives like a benchmark for your reasoning that you can compare against and cost against and say, okay, but if you don't do what seems to be the right thing, what's the consequence of that? If it's a short-term consequence with no ramification around us, well, we can stick to the plan. But if you can actually see that this is going to have a wider impact and you're just trying to hold back spring, then maybe it's better to say, okay, but it seems like we are facing a new reality. Let's do the shift.
Yeah, and I think you answered what I was going to kind of ask, right? Where if navigational strategy, right, is I'm constantly updating my implied strategy as new information comes in. Um, in that framing, surprise is not a disruption per se, but more like just new information that's helping me
Yeah,
refine my
yeah,
strategy. What I'm
yes.
wondering about is if we are constantly updating implied strategy based on surprise, how do you maintain that longer form coherence? What keeps you from pivoting too much?
That's a that's a good question. I think this is one of the classical misunderstandings. So if you accept this role of strategy, you would also insist that for a strategy to be relevant in a context, it needs to be actionable. So we talked about accountable contributions. I see accountable contributions to be collected in what I would call portfolios. And it's the portfolio that's guided by a strategy that then sync up with other portfolios and strategies around it. So in the context of that portfolio, then it's the choices that you can make that determines the time frame that you're in. So if you are developing the next product, then most likely your decisions have an impact of a few months. That's reasonable. You can make those decisions and act on them yourself. But if you're the one who are discussing where should we build our next factory, and the ramp-up time of that factory is something like a few years, given all the certifications and whatever you need to do, then the natural horizon of that type of decision would be years. But you could still learn something today as a surprise that would change your view on whether you should build that factory or not. So it doesn't actually change anything to the planning horizons, which typically follow some type of natural cadences that you know, for example, from pharma products, you know, from construction, etc. But the surprise is always now. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a surprise. And it can bring you significant new information that just makes you pivot on what you thought would be the right thing to do.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I like what you said there. surprise happens now, or it's in the now.
Yes.
That's very interesting.
For some, that's a surprise in itself, but it really is
Well,
what defines a surprise.
yes, no, indeed, indeed. That's why I smiled when you laid it out that way. So like the decision horizon could be years, but the learning horizon is continuous, essentially,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. So
It's
that's what
always,
it's a collapse of
yeah.
the planning cycle. But of course, I mean, we have some probably not so ethical jokes on
Mm.
something that takes a certain point of time, and engaging more people to do it doesn't change that time, no matter what you do. It's just a 9 month process to get a baby.
So couple things, I guess. Maybe expanding on this, right? Using your factory example. If I can't decide whether to build the factory today because of that time horizon, right? It's a long time horizon. I can decide what to learn today that might inform that future decision. So, maybe I run a pilot in a contract manufacturing facility versus building the factory, right? Or maybe I test demand in the market first, or I build relationships with potential suppliers. Those are all choices that are in a shorter time frame that reduces that uncertainty about the
Yeah,
long-term
yeah,
decision, and I can learn from
yeah,
those
yeah,
shorter term
yeah,
choices. Is that right?
yeah. Yeah, exactly. And you actually already today see patterns of innovation which are changing compared to what you're used to. So you can say big organizations which usually carry their infrastructure and innovation internally. But today, increasingly, you see mergers and acquisition as an innovation tool. You're simply waiting for someone to prove that something is viable, and then you pick it up as an acquisition because you already have proof of concept. Now you can use your infrastructure to scale it. It's an example. Or you actually form extensive partnerships, even with some of your competitors, that if something is a bit fuzzy and needs to be puzzled up, you can form strategic partnerships who can better carry the innovation burden of something new and unexplored. And even better, you can realize that this is simply just incremental innovation. So you don't need to have corporate governance on this. You can leave that within the portfolio that's guiding that piece of work. And you don't ever want to hear about it as long as they keep their business sustainable. So
Interesting. Interesting.
autonomy,
Yeah.
acquisition, partnerships are deliberate innovation tools that you see being used today uh, to mitigate some of the risk.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of relates to what we've been talking about with conversational depth, alignment, coordination, right? In the old model, everyone needs to be aligned to the plan before anybody can move. In the model that you're just talking about, portfolios have to be transparent about their strategies, their choices, so others can see how they might be
Yeah,
affected or
yeah,
impacted.
yeah, yeah,
But it's not about getting permission before you act. It's sort of, as you said, bring no surprises, right, to people that depend on you,
yeah,
which is it changes the whole idea of what we talk about when we talk about coordination. The coordination is about
yeah,
not bringing surprises to people versus having to align
yeah,
on a plan before anybody
yeah,
can move. It's
yeah,
less about that
yeah,
control and more about
yeah,
visibility and integration
yeah,
after the fact.
yeah. And there's another part of the story. So we already talked about the accountable contribution, which means that you do the best you can without making the same possible for someone else unintentionally. So you're basically constructive in how you work with others. But that's balanced with portfolios. And the portfolio question would be, are we managing at a speed where we can afford to lose? Do we have a healthy balance in our activity? Do we have a healthy way of spending our money? Do we see the returns we expect to see from the investments we are making? And I'm considering all spent investments because you fund activities with the anticipation of future outcomes. So do you generally see the returns, or do you trust you will get the returns from your investments that can justify this mix of spending? And if you're in the agile community, you will know that that's quite different from what we have been talking about it so far, because we have been talking about portfolio flow. But actually, portfolio is a balancing function. It's not about speed, it's about risk. that you don't spread yourself or concentrate your efforts in a way that you risk losing everything overnight, but you can basically afford to be in the risk you're exposed to at any given moment, even with a few surprises.
That's really interesting. I'd like to just expand on this a little bit with a specific example um, related to the portfolio concept. Let's say we have 3 portfolios. Let's say my portfolio is a product portfolio, and my time horizon is about the next 3 to 6 months of choice, right? What do I build? Who do I serve? How do I position it? Somebody else is running a infrastructure portfolio. So their strategy is about the next 12 to 18 months, right? What platforms do we invest in? What technical debt do we retire? And then the third portfolio, somebody's working on market expansion, right? 2 to 3 year horizon, maybe new geographies that we're exploring. All three, and this is all in the same organization, right? So all 3 strategies need to sync up because my choices depend on infrastructure and market expansion and so on. What does syncing up look like in that scenario?
But you can say if it really is comparing apples and oranges, then I think the syncing up is the risk position that you have to decide how much do you need to invest with what likely outcome in a certain area. And if it's dependent activities, you probably have some way of balancing it out. But at the end of the day, it's simply how many people do you have doing what activity and what risk does that carry in terms of how much is it going to cost and what's our probability of a future outcome. And then from there, so in a sense, this gives you the means to balance it. The detailed calculations of how you do that, that's in the mix of your specific business. But what this way of organizing offers is that it offers transparency and a certain degree of cross comparability. If nothing else, you can try to compare the risk and ask if that's reasonable so that you can better balance out your set of activities. And then there's also the elephant in the room. You have to ask yourself, why do such radically different risk profiles needs to be interdependent? Can't you even split them out and manage them separately so that it becomes a portfolio of independent risk positions that you can then balance with your funding or even make separate businesses?
I think this is where AI becomes really critical, right? In the old model, you're trying to coordinate activity plans across portfolios, requires a lot of overhead, a lot of integration, dependency mapping. In the model that you're talking about, you need to see the allocation of how many people are on what, probability of outcomes, risk levels across portfolios, and dependencies that create risk. AI can probably do a lot of that stuff in real time, maybe flagging things that are getting out of balance. And so this is the syncing happening through that digital visibility and risk monitoring versus that face-to-face coordination?
Well, you could say it's not in that sense a prediction machine. So you still have the same level of uncertainty whether you run a digital organization with AI doing the coordination or whether you run a manual paper and ring binder thing. I don't think that's changing it. But what we are changing is that with AI helping with the coordination, you can actually get rid of some of the old structures that have been scaffolding work. So work has been subordinated to the structure of the organization in the teams, in the silos, led by managers and middle managers. So you somehow were hiding the work in the hierarchy. What you can do now is that you can look at work as virtually defining the organization. You can simply organize to the problems that you're trying to solve. And that inherently gives you more flexibility because you can have people follow work instead of putting people into organizations and feeding them work until you can sense it. It just gives a better direct, non-intermediated connection between the work and what you are really trying to achieve in the organization. So that's what gives the reconfigurability, the fluidity. And then to your earlier point, does that mean that everybody changes team 7 times a day? Absolutely not. That would freak them out, just like we would freak out our customers with an infinite stream of innovations. So I think the pace doesn't necessarily need to be radically different, but the switching cost and your ability to do a switch, a pivot, when a certain opportunity comes across or when you need to respond to a crisis is better because you have more flexibility in how people are organized, even to the level where you can allow people to self-organize around the agreed work which carries your expectations of the future outcomes that you are expecting.
That's really interesting. So let's bring this together. Maybe the last couple questions here, Morten. I've been thinking about how AI can help people focus on the uniquely human capabilities, empathy, judgment, creativity. You're thinking a lot about organizational liquidity, adaptive capacity. It feels like we're seeing the same pattern from different angles. You're thinking about the organizational conditions that allow humans to do their best work. And what I've been trying to explore, think about is what is that best work in light of AI? What is that best actual work for humans to do? Um, am I reading that right? Do you see that interplay there? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, so I think this is one of the areas where there's a lot of learnings to be done. I mean, you simply got to learn it. Um, what I'm occupied with is that you might wrong foot yourself in exploring that huge reshuffle to the book of that title that's going to happen to how business is conducted and where value is migrating to when the whole business ecosystem get a new digital underpinning and new capabilities to perform transactions, etc., very much digitally. And that's something that everybody will be forced to respond to. What does that look like? Well, to your point, I think we got to insist on humanity being front and center. Um, my personal way of saying this is that I really vouch for a zero policy for toxic behaviors in all its shapes and forms. That's an indirect way of saying let's make sure it's safe to contribute, because you don't need to fear that someone wants you ill or are playing games with you, etc. I mean, we just got to strip all of that out so you can have open, transparent, inclusive ways of working, because that's a precondition for being successful with the other things. Why don't we have this already? Well, there's a billion cultural reasons and historical reasons and promotional reasons, etc., for why the world has not been working like that. But it's kind of never been okay. So let's get to it. And I can hear that you agree on this. And of course, it's not a small thing, but it's also something where if you remove the conditions that accept toxic behaviors, like preference in promotional schemes or political decision-making or game playing for your annual bonus, etc., then that's just not helpful for what we want to achieve. And what I'm vouching for is that you got to change the ground conditions first. If you try to sort it out in the frame of the existing hierarchical role-based organization, you're never going to be successful because it's not with you on this agenda. So you got to reconfigure yourself into something that's more collaborative and more structured to the work, and then rebuild the governance you need for that setup to be useful. So in that sense, I talk about a shift to a new type of organization. The thing is that it doesn't actually take long, and it builds on a lot of the elements that you have already. But don't go the incremental path. if nothing else, Gary Hamel has been explaining for 30 years why that's going to be impossible. And just because you have to doesn't make it more likely that you will succeed.
Morten, this has been exactly what I hope for. Two people exploring ideas, finding the unexpected connections. For people listening who maybe just had an insight about organizational design, who see opportunities to think differently about structure, collaboration, what would you say is the very first question that they should ask themselves?
Well, a simple thing is actually to sit down with the team that you work with every day and figure out what is your strategy, because that's going to be important for the way we coordinate work in the future. And then look out for some of the signals that we have been sharing. I think the best example you can compare to is if you're old enough to look back at how was software development before you had continuous integration. And if you're lucky enough to be in a place today where that's an established practice, what is it like today? If you're still tangled up in places where you're not used to that, like big ERP or legacy system, I'm sure you still have a sense of what would it mean to work in a condition where you just would have instant feedback on your technical transaction. That capability is what we are facing at the planning level. What is it going to mean? Well, I don't know. What I'm sure about is that it's coming, and your competitors are on it because they can knock out a lot of internal cost and just be more competitive, more adaptive, more responsive. And with what's facing most businesses today, if not all, they're just going to need that extra mobilization and capacity and agility to face what's coming, provoked and unprovoked in how they conduct the future business. So long story short, time is now. Nothing is missing except you getting your head around it and get cracking.
Morten, thank you so much for your time. This has been a great conversation.
Thank you so much for inviting. Really appreciate it.